Um, Essentially, I'm Sudanese American actually, and a lot of my life is very much embroiled in this topic and in this question. So I approach it as a scholar, as a researcher, but also as someone who has lived a lot of these struggles and is actually very much does my research from the standpoint of wanting to understand and support social justice struggles. So I think this is quite important to say early on. I'm definitely not detached from this question. I think, you know, many of you already know that there has been an uprising going on in Sudan. And in fact, in December, it will be closing its 4th year. So the height of the media attention on what is going on in Sudan was in 2019, which is where this image that I will speak about comes from. But in fact, the uprising is alive and well today. It's just dropped off largely from the media landscape. So a lot of what I will be speaking of will focus on 2019, but it will also draw or relate to what is going on actually today, because as we know with social movements go through a lot of changes quite rapidly, and they learn on the ground in the struggles themselves. And so this is something that I actually right now I'm spending a lot of my time doing, is trying to document these specific spaces. So one of the tools of the resistance in Sudan has been these occupying spaces, these sit-ins where demands are made, but also where conversations happen, where practices emerge in terms of building solidarity and so forth. So what I will be speaking about today is really starting from this question of this one image. So I will share with you this image. I don't know if some of you remember this image. There was a point in a few years ago where it spread many places. And the image is one of a young woman. At first, we didn't know who she was. Her name is, as it emerged, her name is Alaa Salah. She's 22 years old and a student. And for me, as someone who was born in Khartoum, I don't need a lot of background to already know where she is. There's a lot of clues in the picture itself. So I know that she's in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, and I know that she is in the central part of Khartoum. So what I wanted to say is that, you know, this image was posted in Twitter in early April of 2019. And, you know, for some weeks in April and in May, it went viral, first in Sudan itself, and then within the sort of media landscape of the Arab-speaking media, which, you know, Sudan is a predominantly Arabic-speaking country, is embedded in that media landscape. So it circulated in social media. And then it got picked up pretty rapidly by Reuters, the BBC, the New York Times, I mean, France 24, like so many of these sort of Western outlets with a lot of global reach. And then it got picked up in other regions as well. So the photo was taken by a woman, young woman called Lena Haroun, who posted it on Twitter. Now, I think it's important to say Twitter is not a thing in Sudan, not much of a thing in Sudan. I mean, unlike, for example, Tunisia, a country, you know, to the northeast of Sudan and the continent of Africa, which had gone through the first wave of uprisings during what is, you know, what is called often the Arab Spring. Tunisia is very well connected. Sudan is not a particularly well connected country to the net, although, you know, many people do have mobile phones or smartphones, and they use particularly WhatsApp and Facebook. Twitter, there are people who use it, but it's not a kind of it's not widely used within the country. But the image was posted by this young woman on Twitter in early April 2019. And it was taken in this part of Khartoum that is in front of close to the airport and in front of the military general command. And in fact, this is very significant because it's where the sitting was happening. This mass sit-in had happened. Actually, the protesters had occupied this space only a few days ahead of when this image was taken. And it shows this young Sudanese woman that, as I said, we later found out her name is Alaa Salah, and she's 22 years old. Being 22 is not particularly special in Sudan because the vast majority of the population is actually under the age of 24. So maybe 70% of the population is under the age of 24. So it's actually mostly youth that are out on the street in these protests. And many, you could see that she's standing on a car wearing this white dress. We call this type of dress in Sudan, tob, from thob in Arabic, which means dress, but it's actually just a piece of cloth. It's not sewn, and you wrap it around your body, and a lot of women wear it actually in the country. And you see her holding her index finger up, and her mouth is open, so she's speaking. And she's got her other hand on her stomach, but it's actually probably not on her stomach, but this is kind of like how all my mother and aunts and grandmothers, that's kind of how they keep the tob covering their breast, actually. So my guess is that's what she was doing. As she was pulling up her hand, she was trying to keep it down. And it's one of the kind of, I guess, ways of keeping your modesty actually while moving, because this is a loose piece of cloth, right? And you see that around her, it's mostly women, or at least people who look like they are women. They're covering their hair, they're wearing hijab, and a lot of them are holding up their phones and recording. So you see this image multiplied in many different ways from many different perspectives and vantage points, right? And so people are recording her. It gives the impression that she's saying something significant, right? She's definitely at the center, she's higher up, and she's being recorded from multiple directions, right? And actually, if looking at this, before I even know much else about her, I can tell that this fabric is not your everyday common cotton fabric that you would wear when you go out. I mean, this is the kind of fabric that it is, the way it's draped on her is more likely the kind of fabric you would wear when you're going for a special occasion, right, in Sudan. And really women of a certain class are the ones who can afford to wear this kind of fabric. So these are all things just here from this image that me as a Sudanese woman who is from Khartoum would already pick up on. I want to show you the next slide because actually the image became famous, but there was a video that circulated that didn't make it as far. And in the image, what she's actually gives you more information, because what she's actually doing is she's reciting poetry. So I just wanted to share with you because it gives you a lot of a better sense of the atmosphere at the time. Okay, so just to go back to the image briefly. So I don't know if you could hear, probably it's not very clear because it was also taken on someone's phone. And she had spoken at different places and recited this poem that she had written at different places. And at this moment in time, the revolution's been going on for quite some time, right? So this is in the beginning of April 2019, but actually the uprising started in December of 2018. So this is the 4th month of this uprising, of constant daily struggle, actually. And the uprising had started with mainly students, school students, high school students, middle school students, who had gone out in December of 2018 in various cities in Khartoum, in the city of Ad-Damazin, which is in Blue Nile province. This is an area that's very affected by conflict and war. Also in Adbara, which is like the city that has a very strong labor history in Sudan of the Railway Workers Union. So the railways have been introduced by the the British, and it became the hub of their kind of network to get the resources out of the country. And the workers there became extremely militant. And so successive military regimes since independence have tried to break the power of the railway workers and that town where the railways were headquartered. And so that was interesting for someone like me, who is a student and also someone who has lived through earlier uprisings in Sudan as a child, that the protest did not start in Khartoum. It did not start in the center of the city. They actually started very far away from it. And in regions which in Sudan, you say al-manatiq al-muhammasha, the marginalized areas of the country. And this phrase has a very long colonial actually lineage of speaking about the center and then the outside, and post-colonial regimes kind of reproduced this marginalizations of these regions, which became seen as this is where you go to extract resources, both for the capital, but to also send into global markets further into global markets, right? So at the point that this image came up, this was a high point of the uprising. Protests had very rapidly picked up in December of 2018, and they spread pretty much like wildfire. All of a sudden, there were protests everywhere. So while in the beginning, the students were protesting actually the price of bread because the government had increased the price of bread, and bread is kind of, there's always, in most countries, there's always that one food item that, gets people out on the street because it's like what they rely on really, and how they perceive how they're doing is in their ability to purchase that and to eat that one thing. So in Sudan, it's bread, we call it aish. And so basically the students had started out going out and protesting this, but then the protests, as they picked up and went to different places, started picking up a whole host of other demands, right? And other issues. At this point, the military regime of Omar Hassan al-Bashir had been in power for 30 years, since 1989. So a lot of the young people you see in this video had never experienced life under any other form of governance than the one of the military, actually. So this is also quite interesting. In fact, this generation was often spoken of by earlier generations, mine included. I was born in 1978, so I'm the generation before this one. It was always spoken of as either as they don't know anything, because during the 30 years, the regime had wreaked havoc on the educational system. The war had spread across the country, but also there was a shift at the university level from education in English to education only in Arabic. And given this very strong belief in the Sudanese intellectual class that, English is a language of learning and so forth, there was also the feeling that this generation has lost touch with the outside world because it's lost the language that allows them also to speak to the rest of the world. But the military regime was nothing new in the sense that it was 30 years, but the history of post-colonial Sudan was a dance between military coups followed by popular uprisings, which brought down the military regime. There would be brief periods of elections and multi-party democracy, very brief, and then another coup would take place. What is interesting is that at the point that this image came up, it got interpreted on the world stage as the power of women in the protest movement in Sudan and the power of women in protest in general, right? And of course, there was a lot of Orientalist overtones in relation to the kind of admiration partly stemmed from a shock that, a Muslim woman would have this level of agency and would be kind of in a public space and visible in this way. So that was kind of one of the currents that was running across the conversation about this. I want to share with you, I'm going to go back to this image because The most significant thing about it, there's a lot that I can say, is the color of her thobe. So the thobe can be any color, there isn't a specific one. She's wearing a white one, and I want to come back to that because that's a very deliberate choice on her part. So I want to go to this video actually, and this is a video that that someone, actually it's Faiz Abu Bakr, who's since become one of the main chronicles in terms of photo, especially of the revolution, but at the time he was not really known. And it's actually from the neighborhood where I grew up as a child. It's called Burri, and it's a neighborhood in Sudan, right by on the bank of the Nile. And Burri is important in the sense that it was one of the earliest neighborhoods to start forming what we call in Sudan resistance committees, committees of local, mostly youth, who organize work within the neighborhood. And it has one of the oldest ones that predates the revolution. And since there's been multiple, maybe people say thousands of these committees that have sprung up across, and it's one of the reasons why the revolution is still, and the uprising is still going 4 years in, there's been this network in a way to sustain it. But this was one of the first videos. I mean, it wasn't a shock to us that there were so many women out on the protest. We knew that as the protests built up and the demands built up, women would be there for multiple reasons. And one of the reasons is that they have been women's groups confronting the regime for 30 years, right? They have been confronting the regimes for multiple reasons for 30 years. But I remember distinctly that this was one of the first videos that started circulating that was like a moment where it took us a while, I think, for many of us to even know why it was that we couldn't stop watching it. So I wanted to show it and then sort of explain at least my reading of why it was so addictive. Now, this video never made it outside Sudan, really. I added a few subtitles to make it easier to follow. So what is being said actually in this video is, I'm gonna say it is in Sudanese dialect, in Sudanese Arabic dialect, this means the bullet doesn't kill, what kills is the silence of someone, right? And actually, there's something beautiful about it, the colors and all this, but I think what was most captivating, especially for a lot of women who shared this video, was the fact that there was this young woman, young girl, really a child most likely, but maybe on the cusp of puberty. This is all things that I'm reading from this image, who is standing at night after a day of protest. You could still see, the fire is most likely a tire that was burnt. And she's standing there and she is dancing to these chants, and she's wearing a dress that she doesn't have sleeves. It's not going all the way down to her ankles. And she's out at night, and that's the most significant aspect of this. Now, the regime had, for many decades, and it continued up to that moment, it had what was known as the public order laws. And the public order laws are basically a legal framework that was designed to regulate particularly women's behavior in public spaces. And this was adopted at state level. Many states had their own versions. Khartoum had one of the kind of most strictest ones. And it allowed what's known as the public order police to patrol the city and, particularly harass women for what is perceived to be being in the wrong place, mixing with men, and especially wearing the wrong thing. So particularly in the 90s and the 2000s, women would be picked up off the street and then be, flogged, for example, as a punishment for not covering their hair or so forth, because the regime took on a particular interpretation of what it understood as Sharia law. So it looked at that moment like there was real change. This is January 6th. It's only 3 weeks or so after the first very early protest. And at this moment, many people feel that there is something really significant starting to happen. And one of the ways in which this is signaled is the fact that this young woman is out at night, something you would get in trouble with, not just from the state, but usually from your family, and wearing, something she is not supposed to be wearing and standing there, right? And so this was a very important moment. At the time that this image is taken, lots has happened. So the organization of the revolution has taken on a new form. It's become a lot more organized. There's a leadership to the protest. The regime itself knows that it's in trouble. So its repressive apparatus is very much there and very visible and very active. At this moment, around those days, the actual figurehead of the regime fell when this sit-in was successful. And this sit-in was not only in Khartoum, there were at least 13 other sit-ins in other parts of the country. So at this moment, after having battled and fought to get into the space and hold that space, and then make barricades to make it hard to get in, it became like almost like a party atmosphere to an extent, where people would come and recite poetry and play music and so forth. And and the people that are protecting the barricades are the ones who are dealing with the security forces and with the militias and so forth. Now, it's interesting that she's wearing white. So a lot of different interpretations came up of why this image went viral. So a lot of the Western media particularly spoke about how she's essentially, it's like the New York Times said that it's the power of it is having a normal person then taking center stage in this way, and that this would be the iconic photo of the Sudanese revolution. What's interesting about it is her dress choice was building on a stream of protest that had started earlier in March. So at the beginning of March, which is the month before in 2019, women at a private women's college called Ahfad University for Women had decided that they would have a form of protest kind of around, always at that university. The March 8th is always a big deal. And they had decided that one way they would support the revolution was by wearing white thobes. And that would be their way of showing, the strength of women. And there's been many different, I've talked to some of the organizers who started that protest, and different things have come up. For example, the word purity came up. So we chose white because white symbolizes purity. So of course, there's a long feminist history of this idea of white. It's a reason why a lot of brides still to this day in Western countries and actually around the world wear white. So it kind of harks back to this idea of like the virginal young woman kind of thing. But also in their case, what was mostly said was that they picked the color white because it's a form of resistance to the regime. So the regime had favored a particular form of the hijab. And in its early days, especially in its early years, it tried to get rid of this, or at least it tried to discourage the wearing of the thobe, because you could see it in the video that I showed you of her reciting poetry. When you're wearing this thobe, it falls off your head, your hair is exposed. Sometimes you're wearing some short sleeves and your arms are exposed and so forth. So it was deemed by the regime as not Islamic enough. And so essentially they said that wearing the thobe is a form of resistance, but also that they want to connect to their mothers and their grandmothers. And I think this is where it's interesting, because the image was taken as, this is the power of Sudanese women. But if we look at this particular choice, it has a lot to do with a particular trajectory of women within Sudan. So the white dress actually, or the white thobe, is something that was it's associated particularly in Sudan with women who were part of the civil service. So in the 1950s, women in northern Sudan who started, at this point, it was still the colonial period, the first women to enter what was called professions. So who weren't working in the market or who weren't actually homemakers, who actually went out and had careers and got salaries, were nurses and teachers. And the teachers specifically started wearing white. And what's interesting about it is that the white was a way of picking out a woman on the street immediately as someone who is a professional woman. And it then became something that women who started to slowly enter the civil service, especially after 1956, the independence of Sudan, women who went to work at ministries and local government and so forth would wear white. And so it became a tradition and a class marker, essentially, that I am an educated woman and I am a woman who has a profession, right? Women who worked in the markets and who worked in the fields and so forth could not wear that color. Not only because the color was reserved for that, but really it was mainly because the kind of work that they did, they could not keep their white tobe, pristine throughout the day, right? And so by the Ahfad young women choosing this, they were, yes, making a form of resistance that related to the regime's conceptions of how women should dress, but they were also very much privileging one particular history, where a lot of also these professional women and the first women to enter the civil service and so forth were women who were within the racial matrix of Sudan, were classified as Arab women, as Alaa Salah would be as well. And so this protest, women started out going out wearing this white dress, particularly in Khartoum, but also in some other areas of the country. And Alaa Salah had picked up on this. Her poem also picks up on this idea of history and a long line of history, but again, it's very selective in the way that it frames the history of Sudanese women. So she says in her poem, حبوبتي كنداكا وجدي ترحاقة. Haboba in Sudanese Arabic is grandmother. So she says, my grandmother is a Kandaka, and Kandakas are like the Nubian queens, right? From the Nubian civilizations in the far north of Sudan, who were like warrior queens. And so this is my grandmother, and my grandfather is Tarhaqa, one of the Nubian kings. And in a country where there are so many different ethnic groups, but there's a strong racial matrix where particularly Nubian civilization is put up as the civilization, the important civilization, with the others not really paid any attention to. It is also making this lineage of who belongs and who doesn't belong. But of course, the word Kandaka then was co-opted, because any woman who is out in the protest is called the Kandaka in Sudan. So anyone who's out there battling on the street is called the Kandaka, regardless of where she comes from. Now, the Ahfad women, in Ahfad, this university that started this white tobe protest, they were very much known in the 30 years of the regime as having two things. One is the fashion sense. It's a university that has a lot of privileged women, but also just they're very into fashion, and politics is actually banned on the campus. The practice of politics is banned on the campus of the university, but politics was always very present. And one of the ways in which it was present is that, particularly in the 90s, there were very big confrontations between the students and the security services, especially the public order police, outside the gates, because of the ways that some of the girls dressed. For example, wearing trousers, you would get arrested, for wearing trousers and so forth. And so it's looking at this kind of history. But what's interesting is that the most important, the women who had the most confrontations actually with the public order police were not women at Ahfad, were not women who went to university at all. It was actually mainly women who worked on the streets, selling tea and coffee. So we call them tea ladies in Sudan. and also who worked in the markets. Particularly those two groups were really the ones that confronted the public order to police the most. So this is where you see a very intersectional kind of oppression coming through, because a lot of these women, I mean, prior to that regime, you did not really see tea ladies, right? You did not see women with these cafes, these street cafes. You didn't see them because a lot of them were women who had moved and were displaced by the wars in Darfur, in South Sudan, in the Nuba Mountains. So these regions far away from Khartoum that were essentially suppressed and attacked by the regime for their resources, but also to impose particular conceptions of Arabness and Islamic practice. And these wars caused mass migrations out of these regions, a lot of them being women and children, into the cities looking for alternative livelihoods. And many of them ended up working in the markets and selling tea in the street. And so a lot of their clients are actually men. It's not very common to see women other than the tea lady herself sitting in the market in Khartoum or Port Sudan or any of the big cities selling selling tea. It's mostly men, and it's mostly men who are either marginally employed or unemployed. And so these spots became kind of a place of a lot of conversation and a lot of back and forth, a lot of political knowledge and exchange as well over the years of the regime, because people had one resource, and the resource that they had was time. And so, the prices of these cafes allowed them to be there. But these women were constantly in a process of confrontation with the state in multiple ways. So, for example, you'll hear a lot of people say that, especially when describing Alaa Salah and the Ahfad protest, you will hear a lot of people say that it's the national dress of Sudan is the thobe. I mean, it's a very common dress, right? And in fact, the women who had started wearing the white thobe were themselves changing the symbolism of it, because historically it's widows actually who wear the white thobe in mourning when their husbands die. So these women had taken that color and that dress and made something new of it, and then you see these young women taking it and doing something else with it. But the idea that the thobe is the national dress is also, I would argue, should be really contested. This is because in the 1990s, particularly when the public order laws came into being with the regime, a lot of women, particularly non-Muslim women, especially from South Sudan at the time, which was still part of Sudan, who had been displaced by war and who didn't always, depending where they came from, didn't always wear the thobe. It was deemed that their forms of dress, their traditional ways of dressing and the things that they chose to wear were not good enough, were not modest enough. And so they were violently often enforced to wear this thobe. So I say all of this because I'm trying to look beyond this image, right? This beautiful image, and see that there are so many histories and so many narratives that are already wrapped up in that one choice, right, of wearing this dress and this particular color. And that depending how you're positioned, it could mean very different things to you. So the tea ladies, many of them who come from actually Western Sudan, Kordofan and Darfur, also two regions that are heavily affected by war, and many of them who are not Arab within Sudan's racial matrix, they often wear tiab, but the main thing is that their confrontations with the public order was not about wearing trousers so much, but it was really about their actual presence on the street and them as a resource to be exploited. So often they would have their equipment, for example, taken over by the public order police or actually by the locality and then resold to them. So these were women that were trying to live really at the margins of society and really trying to make a living for themselves and their children in a situation that is extremely violent. And so they have tried to organize themselves in many ways. And they were also present in the sit-in spaces where you see Alaa Salah speaking. You just don't see them in the photos, but they are there. They were actually, when the sitting was violently repressed and dispersed a few months after this photo was taken, many of them were the ones who took on the brutality of the violence, because the attack happened very early in the morning by the security forces. Many people were killed that day, and some of them were raped and also disappeared. And so they are the actual resistance on the ground. I mean, there are many streams of it, but they have this kind of history that is not included and not reflected in the symbolism of the white tobe. I also want to show another kind of narrative and coming into this question of the white tobe. So this is an image of Ahmed Omar, and Ahmed Omar is a non-binary, gender fluid artist, Sudanese artist who went to Norway, migrated to Norway, and does his art and is very active also politically in relation to Sudan through his art. And early in March, I believe it was, the 3rd of March, Ahmed Omar, who goes by the pronouns he and him, posted this image on his Instagram and his Facebook. And Instagram, again, like Twitter, is not much of a thing in Sudan, a little bit in the diaspora, but Facebook is very much, if you post something on Facebook, you know, a lot of people are going to see it in the country. And Ahmed Omar posted this photo, which created a storm of reactions within the country. And in this photo, he is wearing the white tobe. He actually goes into detail in the description about the ways that he styled himself. So he is not just wearing the white tobe, but there's a lot of actual different symbolism in what he's wearing. So the necklaces that he's wearing are usually worn by brides. So is the tradition of wearing this type of earring with that's connected to a nose piercing. And you see something brown here, and that's actually like a wallet, a kind of leather purse that our grandmothers, all of our grandmothers, a lot of our grandmothers had, which you wear around the neck. And so he explained in detail that he said that as a gender fluid person, he feels that it is essential to stand with his sisters in their the White March, as he called it, in their resistance. So the day before had been the White Tobe March in Khartoum. And he was protesting the revolution by taking this image. And of course, the reactions were extremely varied. So some people supported him, but there was an extremely also a lot of violence towards him for wearing women's clothing and not only different women's items, but also things that are seen as part of the tradition of Northern Sudanese womanhood, right? And it was very interesting because he let the comments play out, a lot of the comments coming from, fellow revolutionaries, people who went out in protest and organized. And at one point he said, what is the difference between the violence that you are showing to me and the violence that you are fighting against the state? That was also a very powerful moment where you see again this symbol of the white tobe being taken and used and co-opted and kind of given a different kind of history at that point. And what Ahmed Omar was saying, you'd say he was doing it in Norway, but actually the revolution is probably the first time where you see some activism starting to emerge within Sudan itself visibly by queer people. So this was also a really important moment that I wanted to mention. So I want to end actually with this image rather than the image of Alaa Salah. And this is an image of actually mainly tea and food sellers who several years before the revolution had organized a protest, and they're holding a banner that says, which is a kind of refrain that's come up through various social movements within Sudan. But it means we will build that we dream of daily. And the women had, for several years, tried to organize themselves into a kind of form of union or loose association in order to try to protect themselves against the violence of the state, but also the violence of a society that that really pushes them to the margins constantly. So this is one of their forms of resistance. Thank you. This is what I wanted to say, and I hope we can have a good discussion about it.